This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is March 13th, 2025. I'm Scott Glennebaum, and joining me today is Andrew Reeve, the former press secretary and deputy director of communications for the official opposition at the BC legislature, where he worked for multiple BC Liberal Party leaders over the course of 8 years. Andrew, thanks for joining me. Ian's out this week with some family obligations, but I appreciate you stepping in.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
I'm looking forward to hearing from your breadth of experience, kind of a little more in the trenches than either Ian or I have had. So it's going to be an interesting perspective, I'm sure.
It's interesting times these days as well.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit in the before about how some of this stuff kind of rhymes with some past experiences that had been had on it. So we'll be sure to kind of get into that as we cover today's topics, which is Canada's having a new prime minister as the Liberal leadership race has wrapped up. But first, what's going on in BC? The fracture that is the BC Conservative Party, as well as how the province is reacting to, well, just everything going on with tariffs and everything. We're not going to cover the blow-by-blow of what's happening tariff-wise because it will change 3 times before we're finished recording, but we will take a look at what BC is doing in response. But first, you can support the show by going to patreon.com/politicos. So this week, or right after we finished recording last week, I think before the episode even dropped, Dallas Brody got kicked out of the BC Conservative Party. This happened last Friday. This follows a week and a bit of controversy over comments she made regarding the Kamloops residential schools, and as well as refusing calls from the leader of the party, John Rustad, to walk those comments back and apologize. Instead, she doubled down, eventually got removed by the leader, and in the following days, 2 other MLAs resigned in protest from the party and are now sitting as independents.
No, certainly an interesting shakeup at the legislature. I think a lot of people had been waiting for some of these cracks to show. There's been that small group of the BC Conservative Caucus that last year sort of came to attention when they all signed on that letter that had been drafted by the former director of research for the Conservatives, Tim Thielman, basically trying to force MLA Eleanor Sturko out. Some of those folks are now part of this split-away group. Some of them have remained with the BC Conservatives, at least for now. I know the media were calling them the Cancel Caucus at that point, trying to get Eleanor Sturko canceled or kicked out of the caucus. That fracture's been public for a while. Then it went sort of underground, I guess, a little bit, not making it to the media, not making headlines over the last couple months. Resurfaced during the BC Conservative annual general meeting up in Nanaimo, where Tim Thielman, that former director of research who had penned that letter, then ran on, I believe it was a slate or just organized some various other candidates for positions at the annual general meeting. Tim got something like 35 votes or whatever. It was not a successful move. I know John Rustad has commented on that to CBC, basically saying that it was that group of people that were behind this, and that these MLAs had sort of discussed being loyal or at least supporting that side of the party and what direction they wanted to take it in. So where we're at now is, will others join that? There are clearly folks that have some sympathetic views to those that have been kicked out and what they want to do with the party. It's going to be tough for John and his team, who have made a big point of everyone has the freedom to say whatever they want, to bring the hammer down on some of these MLAs in order to keep some of them in the tent. that's a double-edged sword of the no whipped votes type philosophy that they've decided to embrace, which I think John brings to it, having been kicked out of the BC Liberals himself, which is why during the election, when you've had a lot of these scandals and a lot of pretty horrible and heinous things that various Conservative candidates and even some that did get elected said, like Brent Chapman, to then say, well, everyone's entitled to their opinion. They got to stick with it. We don't cancel people. We're against canceling people. Well, this past week, we finally found out what John's line was, what his line in the sand was.
Yeah, like every party eventually ends up somewhere where there's going to be a line in the sand. It's just impossible to not have it. Yeah. But they gave their try all right, trying to get through things without having that. But there's kind of a reason why eventually every party either goes away or professionalizes on this stuff and insists everybody more or less row in the same direction on that. And, you know, the comments are bad, but also what's interesting here is just how all of these mostly new to politics or maybe had a council seat or something locally, but have never really participated in politics at this level, are just kind of going off in all directions and not kind of realizing what's needed to actually go forward on that. And with a new party, that's going to be doubly true.
Absolutely. Politics is a team sport, and it makes it very difficult to take the line that John had, which is everyone's entitled to their own view and their own votes on every single issue. That's really hard to get everybody on the same page, and it causes further divisions. So from a public point of view, it's fantastic to have your MLA being able to speak their mind on whatever it is. That's perhaps more of a pure essence of democracy type thing. But in the current Westminster parliamentary system, it's not as effective in order to be a good opposition. I mean, having to hold the NDP to account as government, it's very difficult when they can lay such an easy trap for them like they did on the Monday morning motion the other week about condemning Donald Trump and the tariffs. And you had 5 members, I believe 3 of them are the 3 that are now independents, but 2 of them are still BC Conservatives, who refused to sign on to that motion and basically say, well, we're not going to condemn Donald Trump and the tariffs that are basically threatening our country and our sovereignty. So then they have to speak to that. Then that completely derails whatever the opposition wanted to do on that day. Now, whatever bill they had or whatever message they wanted to get through to the public, instead they're being hounded by media about the fact that 5 of their MLAs didn't want to condemn Donald Trump and U.S. tariffs. And even if they had their own reasons, which they all seem to have had various different explanations for why they voted against it, it's completely distracting. And as someone that has worked in communications for the opposition, you don't get any of your message out that day. That is a headache for staff. It's a headache to actually achieve anything as an opposition when you have a caucus member that's doing something like that. In this case, it was 5 of them. And 3 of them are gone. 2 of them are still there. And we'll see if something like this happens again, because the NDP are very good at laying those types of traps, especially utilizing the Monday morning motions, which are purely symbolic. They don't mean anything. They don't achieve anything, but it's politics and perception, and they can use that and weaponize it extremely well. And these 5 MLAs fell into that trap.
Yeah, and the opposition is always a tough gig because it's just hard to get the message out. The government is the one with the giant megaphone. Everyone pays attention to them. So even in the best of times, they're fighting uphill, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's that old saying that even the worst day in government is better than the best day in opposition. That's usually true, I would say.
Yeah, and it definitely basically sapped any momentum they had because, you know, the House wasn't sitting. There was that long period after the election, but nevertheless, after the New Year, the Conservatives were landing a few hits. They had the government on the back foot. The government was walking back a bunch of its positions on safe supply and all of that, and yet rather than being able to leverage that momentum, it's basically entirely gone now.
Absolutely. And David Eby has sort of shown himself to be an incredibly practical politician, less ideological. And so while you might know where David Eby personally stands on some things, especially if you've looked at his history and the type of work he's done and past political stances, as premier, we've not really seen that ideology come through as much. He's been very much a practical politician who wants to take anything away from the opposition that can hurt his government. We saw that in the lead up to the election, where suddenly they did an about face on a bunch of issues, safe supply being one of them, to basically take that weapon out of the hands of the BC Conservatives for the election. And here we go again with them going further on that, trying to make sure that there's less ammunition for their opposition, no matter what David Eby might personally believe. He's been very effective at doing that. It's harder to pin him down on issues when he's willing to basically say, well, it looks like the public attitude has totally shifted on the issue of, decriminalization and safe supply. Okay, gone. Let's. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I don't want to give any ammunition to my opponents. So he continues to do that. And yeah, the cons were getting some points over the break, but if they continue to have these stumbles, then that paired with David Eby's practicalism and the fact that he now has Donald Trump as a punching bag and this threat of American tariffs, which is really creating a rally around the flag effect throughout the country. Well, it's going to be tough to break through that.
Yeah, I would just add to that in addition to David Eby's skill at that, I think it's been a general strength of this party and government is that they've not held on to unpopular positions longer than they need to. They're really good at identifying when they're on the losing side of an issue and moving off that quickly. John Horgan was the same. I can think like the museum controversy, for example. Took that one away pretty quickly, and that's generally been a strength of theirs. It's something I'm sure you had a lot of annoyance with in the comms of the official opposition, trying to get something to stick on that, because I seem to remember in the 2017 to 2020 period, it was just really hard under the government at the time to just have the opposition land something that would stick.
Yeah, I mean, it depended on the issue. The museum was a great one where we dined out on that one as long as we could. The public was completely behind us. That one was a really easy thing to oppose when, I'm born and raised here in Victoria. I don't know anyone here that was supportive of upgrading the museum and spending $1 billion in the middle of an economic crisis post-pandemic in order to build a new museum when the one that we had was perfectly fine. And their excuses for doing it ranged from seismic issues to reconciliation. It seemed to change every few days. They really found themselves in a bit of a quagmire on that one. And to John Horgan's credit, he fell on his sword on that one and realized that he'd done a lot of damage to their party with that by basically trying to keep that in the public mind. David Eby very cleverly never really weighed in on that publicly as a minister at the time. I remember we were going through the list of NDP MLAs who'd actually publicly come out and endorsed it. It was in single digits, and David Eby was absent from that list of people that just kind of kept their heads down. Horgan took all the flack, then he resigned, and he killed the museum and resigned. So that was well played by them. I'm sure Horgan may have had some regrets on how it was originally introduced in the first place, but there was a lot of damage that the NDP took on that one. On other issues, though, they were fairly stubborn. Issues like the heat dome deaths, we still never really got any tangible changes from that, aside from maybe the alert ready system has being updated to that. But the coroner's report on that absolutely savaged the government on their inaction on that, and how British Columbia had a disproportionate amount of deaths, and how government had let a lot of people down, and hundreds of people died. So there were some things that we continued to push time after time because there was no movement from the government on it. But I would say, yes, in general, there was a practical sense coming out of the Premier's office of, this is unpopular, we need to change this or fix this. And under David Eby, that only increased. His Premier's office certainly upped their game in terms of what they were willing to throw out and what they were willing to keep, depending on the public mood.
Indeed. If Ian was here, he'd no doubt make a comment along the lines of the merits of that are very much dependent on your perspective, either good or bad, if you actually want to see those changes pushed through, even if they aren't the most popular, because they're the right thing to do.
Yeah. And I would agree. There's a philosophical discussion to be had there of, do you want your politicians to be the type of people that have firm principles and they stand for things and that you know exactly what they're going to do, or do you want your politicians to be subject to the whims of the people? And there's not necessarily a right answer for that. Are you more ideological? Are you more populist? People have different perspectives on that, but it's certainly been very interesting to watch that happen here in British Columbia and see government that is certainly more populist and receptive to the public mood on these things, rather than being ideologically driven, with the exception of a few issues, of course.
Yeah, well, speaking of people that are more ideological than practical, the three MLAs that are out of the Conservative Party caucus now, they're kicking around options on what to do. Initially, from the press conference they gave Monday morning, it looked like they were just going to sit as independents. They later put out a statement clarifying that they might explore starting a new party, but so far they seem to be kind of at a loss of what to do next. They're not moving with kind of the speed I would expect if they were being strategic on how to build out or take any momentum they have going from their departure into building something that could see a challenge to the Conservative Party in Rustad.
Absolutely. And it's something that I think just reflects the fact that they are all fairly new to provincial level politics and partisan politics. None of them have been MLAs before. They don't know how the legislature works. As someone that does know how the legislature works, and permit me a little bit of a nerdy deep dive into the system.
Oh, please do. This is what this podcast is for.
I was quite surprised because in my mind, if I was advising these people, I would have said, okay, well, on Monday, which we just, at the start of this week, because it all went down on Friday, on Monday, you show up and you are caucusing together. It doesn't matter that you don't have a political party. It takes a long time to get a political party up and running with Elections BC registration and all the different regulatory hoops that you have to. It doesn't matter. You don't have to actually have a political party that eventually they will probably want. They'll want to form one in order to get donations and things like that. But you actually could just show up and say we're caucusing together as the Independence Caucus or whatever. At that point, you're then entitled to more money. Someone has to be the House Leader. Someone has to be the whip. Even if you're not whipping vote, that's still a title. That's still a pay bump. So they're actually leaving money on the table, not just for their own salaries, but for staff budget. Because right now, as independents, they're just allocated to what an MLA gets on paper. The moment they say that they're a caucus, then the legislature then has to allocate different office space. They get more money, and they get money to hire additional staff to treat them like a political party. I mean, right now, those three MLAs, they have more members than the Green Party does. The Green Party has two offices in the legislature, one on the first floor, one in the basement. They've got several staffers there, whereas you've got these three Conservative MLAs, or former Conservative MLAs, independents currently, who basically just have their constituency staff working for them right now. How do they get more people working for them in the legislature? Well, they can call themselves a caucus, and eventually, when they create a political party, it'll be whatever that name is, the Freedom Caucus Party or whatever. But at the moment, they could just be an independent caucus. They are leaving money and resources on the table that could help them get their message out there. They'd also have money for advertising and whatnot. So I was puzzled, but that's just because I've been inside for a while, and I was like, oh, that's, why don't they do that? But none of these people have even been elected before. Their staff hasn't. So they don't have that type of advice. They are basically just flailing out there and, making posts on social media. But I caught the CBC coverage of their press conference. And I did notice that Tim Thielman, as well as Paul Ratchford, both, I would say, disaffected BC Conservative members, were with them, sort of staffing them. So perhaps those two are going to be integral to what they're trying to do as a party. And they're probably working behind the scenes with Elections BC about getting a name and doing the type of paperwork that they need to have that set up.
Right, even if they're not doing that out in public, which
Correct.
There's probably an argument for them to be doing too, just to keep things going. Presuming they actually do figure out the inner workings of all this and carry forward, do you think this is going to be the sort of thing that becomes a long-term threat to the Conservative Party and their chances of forming government? They came pretty close last election. Governments tend to only get less popular, but a fractured right can certainly do things to shape that up quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, when we were looking at the election results on election day and seeing how tight it was, I didn't expect it to be that tight. I thought the NDP would have won by a few more seats. I didn't think that the Cons were going to do horrible, but I thought there'd be sort of a larger margin there, perhaps a 10-seat gap or something. But it was all but certain that, okay, well, this is it. This is the end. This is the final term of the NDP. Everyone was like, well, there's no way that they could do a whole other term. The economy will be even worse after former years of NDP mismanagement. That's not their strong suit. And so I think for a lot of people on the sort of free enterprise right side of the political spectrum here in BC, we're like, okay, well, now the BC Cons, they're the party. Everyone has to rally behind them because like that's who's leading the charge into the next election, and it's theirs to lose. They were so close. They've got a huge caucus, and they have 4 years to basically watch the NDP rack up the deficit and do all the things that the NDP do that make them so unpopular that they almost lost the last election. The entire game has been changed by Donald Trump and tariffs. Now, again, this rally around the flag effect, and people are now taking a look at what the BC Conservatives actually have in terms of some of their MLAs and their controversial things that they said. When the last election was very much an anti-incumbent election, which we've seen across the Western world in the last few years, that's just been sort of the move and the shift in politics. But now there's been another shift. So I wouldn't count the NDP out. We don't know what's going to be happening, 4 years from now. We also don't know how the BC Conservatives are going to respond to this. There's certainly a movement of very reasonable, moderate people who are centrists in that party who would love to make that party BC Liberal 2.0 and have it as that rallying ground for the free enterprise coalition that once existed. But that is not true of many of their MLAs and many of their party staff. They do not want to be that. They have actively gone out of their way to disenfranchise the federal Liberal portion of that coalition. And so what we're seeing now is the ball being put in John Rustad's court, and nobody knows which way it's going to go. The forces inside the party are going to all sort of have those internal discussions and see if they can tack to the center. Maybe they won't. Other people will not be interested in that. There's no point in speculating on which way it's going to go. But there's certainly a desire of some people that are not going to be happy with every sort of compromise that the opposition will have to make, month after month after month going forward until the next election. And the Freedom Caucus, or whatever they want to call themselves, is going to be looking quite appetizing to a bunch of the folks on the further right of that party. Not to mention the fact that there are people having discussions about creating a new centrist party. I mean, MLA Corinne Kirkpatrick, a former BC United MLA who ran as an independent in the last election, there's been a fair amount of media coverage about her trying to take back the BC United Party, get their hands on that BC Liberal Party name, and do something with that and have a centrist alternative. If John Rustad doesn't tack to the center, then that's a huge risk to him. That's also a risk to the NDP because people are sick of, after years and years of the NDP, but perhaps are not willing to entertain the BC Conservatives as they get to know them more. Well, then there's a huge opening in the center for a BC Liberal type party there. So the BC Conservatives are probably going to find themselves being pulled in two ways over the next couple of years. And then we'll also have to see what happens with the Greens. I mean, they're in the middle of a leadership contest with Sonia Furstenau having lost, and neither of their two MLAs wanting to be the leader of that party. So whoever the new leader is will have a different dynamic and possibly change the communication strategy and even the alignment and ideology of that party. We saw a huge change when it went from Andrew Reeve to Sonia. I mean, those are two very different politicians with different perspectives. So it could happen again, and we might be in the midst of a real realignment in BC politics right now.
Yeah, that realignment's something I've been thinking about. I'm not entirely sure if the free enterprise coalition's the sort of thing that sits well with the current political moment. It really does feel like the fractures around which politics is getting organized feel increasingly more cultural than economic. And I love to sit around and argue economic policy all day. Like that's I liked it better when we weren't doing culture war all the time, but it's starting to feel like that might be a thing of the past and feel as antiquated as flip phones. Do you think there's a risk that the Free Enterprise Coalition can't hang together because it's no longer the dominant cleavage in politics?
Well, I would argue that it's not currently together. A lot of folks were disenfranchised by what happened between BC United and the BC Conservatives. I know a lot of right-leaning federal liberals who are very politically homeless right now. So the blue liberals and the red Tories, some of them are kind of scratching their heads saying, well, where do I fit in politics right now? Some of them are currently members of the BC Conservatives. But when you sort of see how that party is going to respond to things like what's going to happen with these 3 independent MLAs, that has a very real risk of pushing some of those red Tories out of that party, or making them decide not to run again, or who knows? I mean, if Corinne Kirkpatrick does manage to resurrect the BC Liberal Party, or create a new party, then that could change the game, and maybe you'd have a defection the other way. I mean, things are in flux so much right now that have me back on in 6 months or a year, we probably won't be talking about the same stuff.
No, probably not, especially as things seem to be moving a mile a minute with everything else going on
Absolutely.
in the world, such as the ongoing changes and counter changes and all that to tariff policy. Today, the BC government unveiled the long promise. Well, I guess not all that long, since it's only been a couple of weeks. Feels like it's been forever. Tools to deal with the terror threat, and they're proposing a pretty expansive set of powers that they want to grant themselves to cover a whole range of potential tools. And this would be a bill that is going to sunset in 2027, but between now and then basically gives them a whole bunch of options to just do stuff without passing further legislation and doing almost everything by order in council.
Yeah. What we've seen is the government that has done a lot through order in council anyways. And so I'm taking a look at this act, and was it the Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act? A bit of a mouthful. And it does seem like it could be an overreach, but right now I think there's a public appetite for this, a government that can act very quickly. I don't know how much of it needed to be legislated. I mean, we've seen Doug Ford basically go out there Rambo style and announce things and get changes in action from the U.S. administration. I think every premier in Canada kind of wants to be a Doug Ford right now, with the ability to just say things and get things done. EB's certainly up there in terms of wanting action and wanting to be able to be seen as acting. The stuff that they listed for this act, like the ability to toll commercial vehicle travel between Washington State and Alaska, and things like removing interprovincial trade barriers. Well, I mean, why wouldn't you have a bill on removing interprovincial trade barriers? People have been calling that for years. We've been talking about that for years. And even more recently, it's been, I think Nova Scotia had already tabled a bill on that. So just do it. Let's go rip the Band-Aid off. Why do you need emergency powers in order to do something which I'm sure would have, with your majority in the House, you'd be able to pass that anyways?
Yeah, hell, you'd even get probably most of the Conservatives voting along with that too.
Probably, except for those 5 that didn't want to condemn the tariffs.
Yeah. It's even more ridiculous because we actually had to do a whole free trade agreement internally to get stuff done. It still didn't solve the problem on that. But yeah, the Nova Scotia bill's great. And I really like the fact that it has a only if other provinces recognize it, so it actually gets buy-in from everyone on that. And yeah, hopefully that goes through. But in the meantime, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I think you're all right, though, that both the public mood and kind of the circumstances are going to be pushing for speed of action over long drawn out legislative debates.
Yes.
So in that respect, they probably chose right. And if they didn't put the sunset clause in, I imagine this would be a lot more controversial. But between now and then, it's just letting them go full bore on this, or removing alcohol from the liquor stores that source from the U.S., or their fast tracking of U.S. doctors and nurses. Like all of those things, just pushing quickly on them is probably the right call, both politically and policy wise.
Yeah, these are things that the majority of the public want government to act on. So I don't think we're going to see any sort of backlash towards them doing this. Again, I do question sometimes the need for that, but yeah, as you mentioned, there's a sunset clause of mid 2027. So I think the civil liberties folks will probably be okay, and any lawsuit about that won't be resolved until then anyhow.
Yeah, probably not.
And yeah, the really interesting thing about the liquor situation is there's the public appetite for taking American liquor off the shelves. I'm glad to see it's all American liquor now. But the folks that are producing liquor here in British Columbia, they're now out there saying, well, okay, it's great that we've got these empty shelves that don't have, Jack Daniels and Tennessee bourbon on the shelves anymore and California wine on the shelves anymore. But can you please fill it with ours? And can you please get rid of some of the regulatory hurdles that we're facing? There was a report the other day that said that the craft spirits and craft distillers here in British Columbia, say they're selling a bottle for $50 on a shelf in a BC liquor store. Well, they're only going to make about $19 of profit on that because of how much the BC Liquor Distribution Branch takes off the top and basically penalizes them for the privilege of having it on a BC liquor shelf, whereas that same $50 bottle of, say, Okanagan Spirits or Sheringham Distillery here on the island, that will then be $38 of profit in a private store. So right now our government is talking a really good talk, and they're getting the American alcohol off the shelves. Great, but you need to do more to make sure that the folks that are working in this industry and are facing a tough time right now can actually make a profit and do more with their own product and cater to the BC customers. Make sure that booze can get to British Columbian consumers and consumers across the country. Hopefully, let's eliminate some of those interprovincial trade barriers, but stop penalizing them. It shouldn't be more advantageous for a local craft distiller to have their wares stocked in a private liquor store than the government liquor store, because the government's the one that's talking big about having a Team Canada approach and supporting local. Well, let's put your money where your mouth is and make those changes.
Yeah, it's a great point on that. Yeah, the government's been unfortunately slow, both this one and the last one, of making some long overdue reforms to how liquor works in the province.
We could do a whole episode about my gripes with the BC Liquor Distribution Branch, so we should maybe move on.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're at over half an hour now, and still got to talk to Mark Kearney. So just to round out the BC segment here, the legislature is moving forward with a couple other things. Today, John Rustad put forward a private member's bill to introduce daylight savings time cancellation into law, actually, rather than being the thing that the government talks about twice a year whenever we change our clocks and then stands around waiting for more to happen.
You love to see it. I was part of the team when we were pushing this. A full credit to MLA Linda Larson, who was a BC Liberal MLA back in the day for Boundary Similkameen. This was one of her pet issues. She pushed hard and made it something that was basically our party policy as BC Liberals for a long time. And we pushed John Horgan on this pretty regularly until the NDP finally did something. We finally actually put that out there, but it was always conditional on, well, our American partners to the south who are in the same time zone of, Washington State and Oregon and California, we want to do it all at the same time. So that way we're not, an hour off from our closest trading partners down there. Which made sense, as much as we can gripe about the pain that is the time change and how we want to get rid of it. There's certainly an economic argument to being on the same page as our neighbors to the south. But again, as has been a theme of today's podcast, there's been a shift. And people are maybe not as excited about partnerships with the United States after how we're being treated by them. And we're looking to diversify some of our trading partners and whatnot. So perhaps the idea of waiting on the Americans in order to move on this is no longer what the public wants. So John Rustad putting that bill out, totally agree with the bill. It will be very interesting to monitor the public reception to it as it gets more and more media coverage, because is it time? No pun intended. Do Canadians finally think, and British Columbians think it's time to go on it alone?
Yeah, all the polls I've seen on the question have always just asked about getting rid of daylight saving. I don't think there's been much looked at on whether or not it's a go alone. And I totally agree. It would make sense to coordinate things, but at this point, is it worth waiting around? And is it worth tying ourselves to what the Americans do on this stuff, even if it is going to be more annoying communicating with family members on the other side of the border?
Absolutely. Yeah, the government did a huge consultation. I believe it was one of the most answered government consultations in the history of British Columbia. And people were overwhelmingly in favor of stop the time change. People have different opinions on whether or not to keep daylight savings or not. There's one side or the other, depending on, arguments on whether you want more light and that sort of a thing. But just the desire to stop changing is almost supported by everyone. But yeah, I haven't seen any stats on whether or not folks want to go at it alone.
And a quick final bit in BC politics before we move on to federal. As basically everyone federally have agreed the carbon tax is dead, BC's decided to follow suit. This follows previous comments that David Eby had made around the election time. I think doing what you said earlier about just taking issues off the table on it. But yeah, he came out this week and said, yep, as soon as the feds get rid of it, BC's going to ditch it too. And I guess the 2009 Ats the Tats NDP campaign's finally going to pay off.
Carol James finally won from 2008. There you go.
So I think it's a good policy, but it's politically pretty dead at this point, and be disappointed to see it go. Just BC was a bit of a leader in this, but sometimes you can't fight the tide on some things like that.
I totally agree, Scott. It's a policy that I believe was a good thing and was actually achieving results, especially here in British Columbia after the BC Liberals introduced it as a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Money was going back to people. It was having an actual positive impact, but it just became incredibly unpopular. And when the federal government moved to impose one, and I would say really dropped the ball on messaging and didn't actually adopt the BC Liberal model of having it revenue neutral, then that basically gave Pierre Poilievre, as well as previous Conservative leaders, a chance to attack that. And over time, that messaging just resonated and got through to folks, and it was incredibly unpopular. So what you saw in the Liberal leadership, which I know we'll get to momentarily, was candidates, with the exception of Karina Gould, saying, well, we would also get rid of the carbon tax. I mean, Liberals can't defend this anymore because the population overwhelmingly sees it as a bad thing. And in, the tough economic times, and people are looking at the bill when they fill up their gas tanks and feeling it harder than perhaps they did 5-10 years ago when BC brought it in, then yeah, it's not. It stopped being something that any reasonable politician that wanted to get reelected and be accountable to the people could support. So pledging to get rid of it once the feds do makes a lot of sense. Eby said that to take that off of the table, take that ammunition away from the Conservatives during the election, and today he's saying it once again. And it sounds like Carney's going to sort of scrap that as soon as possible.
Yeah, it's going to be a bit of a headache for them, though, because although they got rid of the full revenue neutrality, there's still a bunch of that revenue gets used to offset some taxes and whatnot. So they're either going to blow the deficit up some more or going to have to do some tax raises. So solves one problem, but introduces another.
Yeah, it's a huge, it is a blow in the government's budget for sure. I mean, that's what the NDP did with the carbon tax. They basically took it and started funneling all that money into government revenue in order to pay for the things that government needed to do, which, when you're running a surplus, maybe that's not, you can give that money back to folks. They are running a deficit, so all that money is already accounted for and spent and out the door. So I remember when we were looking at the effects of it as BC United, of if we said the same thing, of we would scrap it if the feds do, because at the time it seemed like Pierre Poilievre was a shoo-in for the federal election, and it basically seemed like, okay, we were running in the provincial election, and then Pierre Poilievre runs the following year, an election, wins, and then we scrap the carbon tax. We were taking a look at the economic impact of that, and it is a significant impact to basically say goodbye to the carbon tax.
Yeah, so definitely something to watch out for going forward on how they square that circle.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to kind of what I think has to be the biggest news of the week in Canada so far is the Liberal leadership race has wrapped up with a rather definitive result.
Yeah.
Mark Carney won with 86% of the vote, making, I think, one of the biggest blowout leadership races in Canadian history, or at least since we've gone to away from the delegated conventions to a one-member, one-vote approach. But very decisive win. The next runner-up, Chrystia Freeland, came in at 8% with just 11,134 votes. It got noted that I believe her opponent in the last election she ran in her riding got more votes as the runner-up than she succeeded in that one. And just go further down the list with Karina Gould and Frank Baylis, it's even fewer. So very definitive result for Carney on this one.
Yeah, I was shocked by the totality of his victory. The fact that he won every single riding in the country was just wild to me. He's you mentioned Chrystia Freeland. I mean, she lost her own riding. She performed best in her own riding, but her best was still not enough to actually win more votes than Mark Carney in her own riding. Same goes for Karina Gould. So to see that was just, I was surprised at the extent of Carney's victory, and I thought Christia's campaign would have performed better than that. I think no one was surprised that Carney won, but the extent at which he won was quite shocking. I thought that Chrystia Freeland would have probably gotten at least 20%. The fact that she got 8% was just shocking.
Yeah. So what do you think that means for the party? Because this is something that's outside the ordinary, and especially when you consider that a sizable chunk of that vote is coming from Quebec, and Mark Carney's French was not great. He sounds like I do when I try and speak French, and that should not be the bar any politician is trying to measure themselves against. And yet won decisively in Quebec. It was an interesting race in that there wasn't a francophone in there, but Karina Gould's was pretty decent for an anglophone.
Yeah, and Frank Baylis, as a Montreal businessman, had great French.
Yeah, but interestingly, didn't seem to really play in to the results, which is kind of a departure from what one's seen in the past when it comes to the Liberal Party.
Yeah, I mean, again, coming back to our overall theme of there's been this huge shift. It doesn't matter in this particular case. I mean, you had Quebecois Liberals coming out and saying it doesn't matter that his French isn't that great. I am voting for the person that I want to be having that meeting in the Oval Office opposite Donald Trump. And that was the number one motivating factor. And in Quebec, often the Francophone and the policy on various Quebec issues are the priority, unlike other provinces where we tend to sort of look at that national level. But things have shifted so much. There's been such a seismic change in politics in North America that the number one issue was Trump. And that's why Carney, whether you're in Quebec or in any other province, that was probably the reason that you were voting for him. His economic know-how, his expertise, his international connections, and he was the person that 130,000 odd federal Liberals across the country thought he's the guy that I want pictured in the Oval Office, talking to Trump, sitting down in those chairs where Zelensky was the other day. Who's going to handle that best? And so people went for Carney, and it gives him a huge mandate, 86%. He can do what he pleases at this point. And I'm very glad to see it looks like he's going to reduce the size of cabinet. I think cabinet's been bloated for a long time, really cut down on those numbers. And then today it announced his first state visit is going to be heading over to Europe, which departs from, I would say, the usual tradition for a new prime minister whose first official state visit would be the United States.
Yeah, there's probably a good reason on that.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely a signal that Canada's not looking at the states the same way as before.
Absolutely, yeah, and that reflects where Canadians are as well. So he is, it's probably a smart move in terms of optics and politics, in order to go and shore up some of those European alliances and those old relationships. He was governor of Bank of England and has a lot of experience in Europe. So I imagine that he has a lot of friends and contacts and connections there that will be very helpful when we start needing to look for diversifying our trade and our alliances, and also talking about where we fit in the sort of global geopolitical situation with America possibly pulling out of NATO and changing their relationship with foreign affairs.
Yeah, that's going to be a huge challenge for us. And that's kind of the thing I've been keeping the close eye on in terms of just how everyone in government's talking. And it still seems like everyone's not quite grasping just how seismic the change is. It's kind of reactive, kind of following up. And it's going to be interesting to see if this results in a government that kind of tries to get out ahead of any of this, or if it's just going to be 4 years of just being reactive on everything. And what's going to done with that, because there needs to be some pretty significant changes in just how Canada operates if it's going to be in a position that's never really found itself in, of not having a close relationship with the dominant power of the era. Before we had Britain doing that, and after the war, it changed the US, but we've always had that comfortable relationship with, if not the hegemon, one of the great powers, and that's not something we're used to doing by ourselves, and that's going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, it's been very interesting to see how this has sort of changed realities. I mean, coming back to BC here, if you told me 2 years ago that David Eby would be talking about fast-tracking natural resource projects, I would have said, what on earth are you talking about? I mean, the throne speech that the NDP delivered here in British Columbia, the first, 33 to 50% of it was something that I could have written as a BC Liberal. It was very much about, supporting the economy and jobs and reducing barriers and cutting down on red tape and the size of government. I mean, it was classic BC Liberal talking points. So everything has absolutely changed. And getting out in front of this stuff, yeah, I mean, if you'd listened to us, we wouldn't be needing to fast track these resource projects because we would have been government and we would have done them. But perhaps that is happening now at the federal level as well, of the Liberals saying, well, we need to get out ahead of a lot of this and we need to start making those investments. During the debate, Mark Carney, I really liked what he had to say about defense spending and being smart about it. I think Karina Gould tried to get in a point about how he refused to do everything immediately and fast track all this money out the door for defense. And as a former central banker, I think he may not have messaged it as a politician should have, but his answer was excellent, basically talking about how we need to do things right. And, Canada has had a horrible track record when it comes to military procurement and various issues like that. So the fact that he was being hesitant when the easy politician answer would be like, of course, we're going to fast track the money out the door for defense because we need to, meet our NATO spending targets and whatnot. Well, to say we need to do it right and we need to be smart about this and strategic, while still obviously having, a fire under our ass and saying we need to do something. I appreciated that, even if it wasn't the tight political messaging that a tried and true politician would have delivered.
Yeah, well, you could do a whole episode just on the BC litter issues. I could talk for hours on defense and all the problems there. I didn't entirely agree with his answer on that. I think in the current situation, speed does need to be a pretty significant factor on that, just as there is so much rebuilding that needs to be done, and it's not really there's not really enough runway to also use that as a giant industrial strategy over the short term. Medium to long term, definitely agree, need more defense production capacity in Canada, but if we can get subs or tanks or self-propelled artillery from Korea or Germany, let's get that today rather than trying to find the optimum way to make sure there's Canadian manufacturing jobs associated with it. And the 2% of GDP is also kind of one of those interesting things where I think that's one of those signs of people haven't really flipped to the new reality yet. The 2% target is an important one. It's something we've agreed to, and we should follow through on that. But I'm not sure it should be the benchmark by which we measure success, because right now we have a much more immediate problem of assuming a neutral to potentially adversarial neighbor, a second one, just Russia's on the northern flank. What is the stuff we need to do, the capabilities we need to require, the force size and all that needs to be in place to handle our own defense and sovereignty? What do we need for that? And it's not necessarily just going to be a simple percentage of GDP number. It's do we need more fighters? Do we need better ships and submarines? Should we be looking at nuclear subs? All that stuff. And I kind of feel like the 2% of GDP target has been talked about so much. It's kind of become the benchmark, but it probably shouldn't be the thing we're looking at as the sign of success or failure going forward.
I totally agree, Scott. I mean, also 2% of our GDP is, very different from other NATO members, and you have to take into effect things like purchasing power parity. I mean, 2% of Poland's GDP, with the way that the money stretches there, is a lot different from the way that the Canadian dollar stretches here. And Poland, of course, is exceeding their 2% target,
but their money,
their money's going further as well, because they, wages and whatnot that are in Poland. So that's a completely arbitrary number that we've just invented to try to keep people at a place. I mean, if every single NATO country, aside from the United States, suddenly was at 5% of their GDP on defense spending, then we would basically rival the United States. We would even surpass them if Europe and Canada and NATO members were suddenly spending 5%. I mean, it's huge if we were to do something like that. But you're right. We need to be looking at what capabilities Canada needs. I mean, I know the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy, Vice Admiral Topshee, he was quoted the other day of saying, we need to get 12 new under ice capable submarines. In the past, we've had it's been a bit of a joke for as long as I can remember, since we bought those British subs, the Victoria class subs from the Brits in the 90s, and they were catching on fire and sinking and all sorts of ridiculousness, and it became kind of a joke
the bad
in Canada.
Sinking for a sub, just to be clear.
Yeah. But the whole purpose of those subs was basically training our ships in order to do anti-submarine warfare. The subs themselves were not the strategic asset that Canada was looking for. That's changed now. Now the Royal Canadian Navy is saying, well, we need 12 under ice capable subs for Arctic sovereignty. This isn't to train our ships and to conduct, anti-submarine warfare. This is actually to secure our sovereignty in the Arctic, and we actually need submarines as part of our naval capacity. So again, everything is changing, and having to buy 12 new subs, well, that doesn't matter if we're hitting a 2% of GDP. We need to probably be spending a lot more than that. We need to be spending it wisely, and we need to be spending it not in America. There's a lot of concerns after we saw American F-16s in Ukraine. You can limit the abilities, because it's all American software and they can actually just turn certain things off in order to prevent the Ukrainians from being able to do X, Y, and Z. Well, we're buying, what is it, $19 billion or something of F-35s from the States, and we don't have full access to that hardware. We can't go in and change that software. So when we're looking at buying something like new submarines, we're going to have to look at South Korea. We're going to have to look at Germany and not look at the United States.
Yeah, the F-35 in particular is a real interesting problem because it's not like there's a comparable alternative out there on the market. It really is the only fifth generation stealth fighter we have. So there's still probably an argument for proceeding on that, but it's definitely not a all your eggs in one basket sort of deal like we've generally done. Because operationally, logistically, cost-wise, keeping the number of different aircraft models down makes just a lot of sense. It's cheaper, easier to run an Air Force that only has one model of fighter. But that might be something we should be looking at, is diversifying the fighter fleet beyond just a single aircraft type like we have done for the past several generations of fighter craft. So one of those things that ought to be taken around, and it's a new era, so hopefully the people at NDHQ and the various departments that are responsible for providing the funds and helping out with procurement on that are considering all of those options too, and aren't just going to be carrying on in their old habits.
100%. And Canadians aren't the only ones noticing. I mean, the fact that just last week there was a Globe and Mail article, I believe, saying that Germany and Norway were inviting Canada early access to a new submarine development project. You have countries coming to us because they're looking at our situation. They're looking how the United States is treating us. They're looking at how Canadians are feeling about this tariff war and how our closest ally is not acting like our closest ally anymore. And they're seeing an opportunity there of like, well, hey, Germany and Norway, we can help you out. Why don't you get in on this new submarine that we're developing? Then you can be getting new submarines right off the production line at the same time that we are. You know, you won't be at the back of the line. One submarine's going to Germany, one's Norway, one Canada, and then, rinse and repeat, as opposed to, the subs that have already been ordered. Well, Canada, you're at the back of the line. You get in on this, start developing it with us, then you can be part of our partner. And then same with what's going on with South Korean shipbuilders reaching out and saying, hey, we'll sell you some submarines. And when it comes to South Korea, who have excellent shipbuilders, they're going to give us full tech access and maintenance in Canada. And they're also a NATO partner. They're not a member of NATO, but they're a NATO partner. So it's all sort of compatible systems, but we'd actually get full access to the systems, unlike, the tech issue with the F-35. So countries around the world are noticing, and they're reaching out to Canada. So I really hope that our federal government is paying attention and they're taking this as seriously as our international partners seem to be.
Indeed. Well, to quickly wrap up here, since we're coming up on time, tomorrow, before this thing is probably out, the new Prime Minister will be sworn in. We're already hearing bits and pieces about what the cabinet's going to look like when he is sworn in. So far, the reporting is that Stephen Guilbeault, the Environment Minister, is out. Same thing with Jean-Yves Duclos, which I think caught a lot of people off guard by that. He's the Quebec Liberal lieutenant, as well as the Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Something we were just talking about, how important that is to have going, right? He's also going to be out of cabinet, which is interesting because he's generally, I think, being seen as, if not a particularly high profile or flashy, a capable minister. But keeping their jobs, at least according to the report as of now, Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc, and Innovation Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what the final list looks like. I'm totally in support of reducing the size of cabinet, as I mentioned earlier. The cabinet has become bloated with 37 federal ministers, people that used to be, parliamentary secretary level. Well, we'll just turn that into a full ministry now. and sort of beef up the size of cabinet. You get a pay raise. It's a loyalty thing. You're less likely to take on the prime minister if you're. I don't like how cabinet has grown under the. Well, it started under Harper as well, but just centralization in the prime minister's office and the growth of cabinet. I think watching Carney say, "I'm going to bring this down to 15 to 20 cabinet ministers," I think that's an excellent move, and will do wonders for actually being able to get stuff done. Because having that many voices in a cabinet room basically just lets the prime minister's office get away with centralizing things, because there's a decision by committee is never going to actually get anything done.
Yeah, and hopefully also the ministers get a little more slack and less direction from the center or overwhelming control from the center that characterize the Trudeau government. Really seem to become a real problem for them, that with everything so centralized in the government, there were only a few key decision makers and staff that everything had to run through. And, you can't just run a government that size out of a few staffers in the PMO. So it's going to be interesting on that. It's something that I've been concerned about with Mark Carney, is that a lot of the team that was behind Trudeau is the same team that joined up to help him in his leadership race and presumably will help fill out the PMO now that he's becoming prime minister. And I'm hoping a lot of the bad habits aren't going to get carried forward, but it does somewhat concern me that those same people are going to be there, and that you could already see a little bit of that in some of just the way some of the communications were done on the Carney campaign. There's an echo of Trudeau that you could see in some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just push back real quick on the it wasn't Trudeau that really started the centralization in the PMO. I mean, the boys in the short pants was that term that was very closely associated with the Stephen Harper government, of PMO young male staffers showing up and bossing ministers around and telling them what to do. Trudeau campaigned on something different and didn't deliver on that. He continued to have very centralized PMO control. But I don't know if that's going to change under Carney either, simply because of the momentum and the inertia. Reducing the size of cabinet is something. Reducing the influence of the PMO staffers on elected officials is a completely different thing. And as someone that is incredibly smart and accomplished, but hasn't spent time in elected office, I don't know if that'll even be something anywhere near the top of Carney's agenda, which is going to be, doing anything about how much power his staff has. I just don't see that necessarily changing.
All right. Well, just kind of, I guess, final thoughts on what this means for Canadian politics, and kind of what you're looking forward to, expecting as things go forward with a new prime minister.
I mean, election timing is probably the $1 million question. You can argue both sides of, you want to rip the Band-Aid off and say the prime minister wants to have a mandate in order to deal with this crisis that has been delayed for the fact that there needed to be a leadership contest. And so we've kind of not had that level of prime ministerial leadership at the forefront in dealing with this crisis, because we sort of had a lame duck prime minister. So get the election done, next Friday, which is one of the rumors. But then there's also the other side of it, which is Carney is an unknown quantity for a lot of people, and now he's going to be prime minister. And does he want to be able to show what he can do? Does he have a few things that he wants to achieve and actually show, oh, that's how he's different from Trudeau. That's what he's taking on. Again, you can argue either side of it, so I'm not going to try to predict whether we're going to an election next Friday. But I do think that what I've heard from people who, including New Democrats that are very supportive of Carney, it's very interesting that he's been able to be seen as a uniting figure because of how much people care about the Trump and the tariffs issue, and how much the U.S. administration has gone out of its way to demonize Canadians and treat us like the bad guy, as if we've been taking advantage of America for all these years because of a trade deficit, which in reality is something that has been incredibly advantageous for the Americans, because say getting our gas at a lower price because we basically had a captive market because governments in this country, including the Horgan government, wanted to use every tool in the toolbox to stop further pipelines from getting out to the West Coast so we could ship oil to other markets like China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia. That has been to the benefit of Americans because they pay a lower price for our oil than the world market because they know that they're our customer. So yes, there's a trade deficit. This is something that has been overwhelmingly beneficial to the United States, and Trump looking at this issue as if it's a simple ledger of money in and out is incredibly flawed, and it has changed the entire relationship. So having someone that people see as someone that has good fiscal sense, like Mark Carney, and has an economic background, he will be perhaps the liberal. I've called him a liberal Stephen Harper, someone that isn't charismatic, that isn't super exciting, but someone who has that economic background and smarts and competence. I know plenty of my liberal friends won't like me calling him a liberal Stephen Harper, and many of my conservative friends won't like it either. But I think the analogy is apt because of, at least from my perspective of Stephen Harper, that was what he was. He was a steady hand on the economy, but certainly no charismatic politician who was sweeping people off their feet, and no one was talking about how great he looked or how great his speeches were. So that's now what the public is in the mood for. They were in the mood to kick Trudeau out and get Pierre Poilievre, and it looked like he had a pretty easy cruise into government, and now everything has changed. Again, I know federal New Democrats that are probably going to be voting Liberal this election. Everything has been shifted. There's just this realignment that's happened, and with Trump as the number one issue, folks are taking a look again at what the Liberal Party stands for and who they want sitting across the negotiating table with Donald Trump.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much all that. Andrew, thanks for joining me tonight and filling in for Ian. If people are interested in following you, do you have social media or anything, or have you been part of the big exodus out of that?
I still do have a Twitter account, although I've not been very active on it since my departure from politics in 2024. But you can find me at Andrew J. Reeve, and that's probably the best way to get in touch.
Okay, great, Andrew. Once again, thanks for joining me tonight. It's been a fun discussion.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott. We can nerd out about defense policy anytime.
Sounds good. I might just take you up on that. And that has been Playtoast. Find links to everything we talked about at playtoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/playtoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikoff. Playtoast is a production of Legend Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Thanks for listening.